Noreen Gosch, your son gets a strange feeling about this man. He says, I'm going home. He starts walking down the street with your dog and his wagon full of newspapers. The man flicks his dome light 3 or 4 times, obviously a signal, speeds away. What happened then?
As he sped away, the witnesses noticed that after Johnny got about a half a block away, another man came out from between 2 houses and began following my son down the street and around the next corner, which then put him out of eyesight from the witnesses that were folding the papers. The boys, there was a boy that was in his bedroom at the other corner, and he heard some noise outside, and he looked out in time to see the man on foot shoot Johnny with what he said was a stun gun or something of that nature, because Johnny dropped to the ground. Then they scooped Johnny up. There was someone in the back seat of the car that helped pull Johnny into the car.
The same car driven by the man.
Same car. The man had circled the block and came up from the other street. And the man that was on foot, who shot Johnny, and someone in the back seat of the car loaded Johnny's body into the car. Then they sped away, running the stop sign and heading north towards the interstate. They went about 5 blocks, pulled off where they had a van parked, and they took Johnny's body from the car, put it in the van, and then they drove away. There was another driver waiting in the dark blue van.
How do we know that part of it, Mrs. Gosch? We know what happened when Johnny was hit with the stun gun, because there was a witness looking out of his window.
Right. After Johnny was kidnapped, the police kept saying that Johnny was probably a runaway, and they did not start a proper investigation. I hired private investigators, and my private investigators went house to house, questioning everybody. In case anybody was up at that time of the morning, did they see anything? One gentleman, 5 blocks away, saw the van parked, and the reason it was suspicious, it was sitting there with the motor running, and it had kind of a loud motor. That's what got his attention. He'd gotten up early to get the Sunday paper and make some coffee. And he looked out, and he saw this blue car pull up, and he saw men take something from the back seat that was long and appeared to be wrapped in a blanket and stick it in the van. And then they all took off. He did not know it was a body. He did not know a kidnapping had just happened. Following the kidnapping, once it was on the news, the man tried to tell the police what he saw, and they dismissed it. They did not do anything with it. It wasn't until my private investigators came along and questioned everybody, and we began to put and assemble this whole crime scene. Years later,
the key witness did not emerge until many years later. Isn't that the case?
What's that?
Is it the case that a key witness to all of this, to the kidnapping, did not emerge until many years later?
Well, it was just 2 weeks ago that the young boy that was in the bedroom finally told us that what he had seen was Johnny being dropped to the ground by the stun gun.
What was his explanation for waiting so long?
He had reported all that to the police the day of the kidnapping.
He had reported it?
Yes, he did, and the police chief told him to keep quiet, and the police chief came out with a different story and said nobody actually saw Johnny being stuffed into a car, so therefore they had no crime. The police chief would not call in the FBI. I called them myself. They came over to the house, and they said, we're not going to enter the case because the police chief says we have no crime. We have since learned that police chief was going over to Omaha on a regular basis and participating in the sex parties that were going on where they were using young children. Our police chief was a pedophile. He was involved.
What was his name?
His name was Orville Cooney. He's now dead. Died of a heart attack a few years ago. And we have all this information, and that is why they tried to silence the one victim, or the one witness. That way they had deniability. They could then write it off and say, well, he probably ran away. Nobody saw him being thrown in the car.
You mentioned Omaha. All right. Now, that, of course, brings into the discussion the Franklin cover-up by Senator John DeCamp, for many years member of the Nebraska legislature, Nebraska State Senator, Attorney John DeCamp, in his book, The Franklin Cover-Up. What has Senator DeCamp discovered specifically with regard to your son? Of course, what Senator DeCamp was writing about, as you indicated a moment ago, is a huge pedophile ring operating in Omaha, which has tentacles throughout the United States, reaching across the country, even into the District of Criminals, Washington, D.C. Has Senator DeCamp discovered anything specific with regard to your son, Johnny?
Yes, he did. As a matter of fact, he represented Paul Bonacci and a number of the other kids. There were 80 children in Omaha, Nebraska that came forward with their stories about this abuse and this prostitution ring that was occurring over there. John DeCamp represented Paul Bonacci. Paul Bonacci confessed to his attorney about his involvement in Johnny's kidnapping. And I've been working with John DeCamp all these many years, and we share information and put things together with what he's learned and what we have been able to document. And all the information that we got from Paul Bonacci, we have been able to document as fact.
Now, was Paul Bonacci there at the kidnapping? Was he in the car?
Yes, he was the young man in the car. He was the one that helped pull Johnny's body in the car, and it was his job to hold a cloth over his face with chloroform on it in case he were to come back conscious after the stun gun. So they did it both. They shot him with some type of a stun gun situation, and then they chloroformed him as they drove away.
Now, let me ask you a question, a troubling question, Mrs. Gosch. How many children do you have?
I have 3.
You have 3 children?
Yes.
Okay. Now, the other 2, of course, I assume are leading normal lives. Nothing's wrong.
Yeah, they are. They're fine.
Oh, thank God. I all this time I've been afraid to ask that question. I was afraid maybe Johnny was your only child.
No, he was our youngest.
Now, of course, you have tried to break through with this story into what we here at the Republic Broadcasting Network call the prostitute national press, CBS, CNN, and so on, the New York Times, and so on. What has been your experience with the so-called establishment media?
Well, initially, and for a great many years, I have been on probably 65 network TV shows, and they included all the talk shows, Inside Edition, 48 Hours, all of those type of shows, the morning and evening national news, Good Morning America, the Today Show, anything of that nature. There was a HBO movie done about Johnny's case. But as we were doing a lot of those, we didn't have all the information that we have today.
Yes.
Once the information began to surface, how deep this goes, how high it goes, and all of these features to the story, then there was a reluctance by the network media to want to do the story again and revisit it with this new information because it had such strong implications of wrongdoing.
How deep and how high does it go, Noreen Gosch?
Well, as you mentioned, the District of Criminals, we know for a fact that one of the people involved running the prostitution ring, his name was Larry King, and it's not the Larry King on television with CNN. It's a different Larry King who operated the Franklin Credit Union, which was basically a money laundering operation for NAMBLA, North American Man-Boy Love Association.
Yes.
He rented a house on Embassy Row in Washington, D.C., and that's where he would have these big gala parties. The parties would be for politicians, and they would just be the regular type of gathering and party. Then after the party, there would be another party. Many of the straight people went home. Those that were interested in partaking of young boys and young girls stayed on. And that's when they rolled out the cocaine. They rolled out anything a person would want. And they had young children for the using. And Larry King, it was important to him to get evidence of these deeds.
Blackmail.
So he had blackmail. So he had his own photographer, and his photographer's name is Rusty Nelson. And Rusty Nelson has now come out publicly and is telling his story about how he was used. He was hired basically because he was a good photographer. Then after he got the job, and he was young, he just needed the money and needed to work. Then after he hired on with Larry King, King began having him photograph some very controversial things in an effort to have leverage and blackmail material over others. For instance, if you have somebody that's very influential, and let's say they might be in a voting position, and you've got incriminating photographs of them, they'll pretty much do whatever you want. And Larry King was in the process of putting people in his back pocket, so to speak. He was later arrested, and he did spend 11 years in jail. He was released April 11th, 2001, and I was told that he returned to Washington, D.C., where there was a job awaiting him somewhere in the Republican Party, and I believe he is still there at this time.
So you're telling us, Noreen Gosch, that this monster, Larry King, who starts out in Omaha, he's a swindler. He's responsible for embezzling tens of millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. He is also a monster who is a pedophile who kidnaps, tricks, entices young children into his ring where they serve as homosexual prostitutes and victims of his fellow pedophile monsters. You're telling us that a man who has committed all this and served 11 years in prison, not for the pedophile activities, but for, as I understand it, for the embezzling, this man now is released and is working for the Republican Party?
That was reported to me by John DeCamp, Senator DeCamp.
Do we know where in the Republican Party
I do not know. I was just in a conversation that Senator DeCamp told me that he moved to Washington, D.C., and he had heard that he had a job awaiting him at some function. He sang the national anthem at the Republican convention in
1984
and 88.
84 in 80. Golly, I think I was at that convention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a lot of people there, and he sang the national anthem. He was the fastest rising black star in the Republican Party at one time, before everything kind of went downhill.
Do you have a line on any of the people he was blackmailing, Mrs. Gosch? I
do not, but John DeCamp, through Rusty and through the others that he represented, Paul Benassi, probably do. Paul Benassi describes being taken to the house on Embassy Row, being kept there until the party after the party, and then being told what to do for different individuals sexually. And Benassi knew that photographs were being taken for blackmail purposes.
Now, it
was quite a tidy operation that they were running for a long time.
We know, Noreen Gosch, that during the first Bush administration, there was a homosexual prostitution ring at work in the White House.
Yes,
we know that it included...
Craig Spence and Barney Frank were involved in that. Mm-hmm.
Craig Spence, Barney Frank. We know... well, of course, we know that Barney Frank was running a homosexual prostitution ring out of his apartment.
That's correct.
All right. We know that these people had such influence that they could conduct guided tours for their guests of the White House at 1 a.m.
Yes.
How much clout do you have access to the White House where you can take guests around the White House at 1 a.m.? While the president is asleep in the same building.
Then if you want to jump start and go